I figure it's your show. I would like you to talk for a little bit. But yes, we are right at 8:30. Good morning, everyone. This is Alice with the Carbon Chamber and Economic Development Corporation. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 Economic Outlook brought to you by Mester Trust and our sponsor partner, PPL Electric Utilities, who you will hear from in just a few minutes. A few housekeeping items. As you heard when you logged in, this program today is being recorded and will be used for later viewing. It's a closed presentation today, so you are being muted and your videos are being turned off. If you put your photo up there, we will keep that on. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, Dr. Ed encourages you to use the chat box, and we'll get through those questions as they pop up. Finally, thank you for your continued support of the Carbon Chamber and Economic Development Corporation and the Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce. Without members and guests like you at our virtual events, we would not have been able to have the impact on local businesses that we've had throughout the year when they've needed us the most. Together, we're keeping local businesses open, and we encourage you to continue to support your local Carbon County businesses. I'd like to introduce to you Carbon County's GEM, our Executive Director, Marlon Kistner.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me, Alice?
We sure can.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be able to bring this again, and I really want to thank Pat Riley and Marty McGuire from Mester Trust for your partnership in bringing Dr. Seyfried to us year after year. It truly is a wonderful program, and I'm sure today is going to be very exciting to hear from you, Dr. Ed. I also want to thank Jane George from PPL. Your sponsorship and support is so grateful for us at the Chamber, but I really want to thank you for supporting and protecting our local communities, Jane, especially in the Carbon County area, and welcome aboard. I want to say thank you to our awesome Alice, our Assistant Vice President of CCEDC, for really being our producer for today's program and all you do for our community. And lastly, just as Alice said, I want to thank all of you that are here today for your partnership and support. It's so, so crucial that we have you and really what we're doing in the community. We're working so close with our commissioners where we really took part in a great COVID-19 grant program, as well as the Lehigh Valley Chamber's grant program as well, just to help our businesses out of the gate. So we're here for you, and we're definitely looking forward to working with all of you as we navigate our future, that's for sure. But we're going to do this together, and again, just thanks to everyone, and especially thanks to Mester Trust and Dr. Ed for today.
Great, thank you so much, Marlon. As we mentioned, today's event is sponsored by PPL Electric Utilities, and Jane George is on the line. Jane, if you would like to say good morning to our guests, that would be amazing.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Alice. And as Marlon and Alice said, we are so thrilled to be a part of this very important breakfast and update. I think that, as we've all said, I think that kudos really need to go to the Chamber for being able to pivot and be able to still offer very important forums like the one that we're going to hear very shortly. I know that I personally am very much looking forward to hearing from Dr. Seyfried. I enjoyed at the beginning of the program listening to him speak with Pat a little bit, giving a little bit of a preview of what's going on, because I think we all know that there have been new challenges for our community since the start of this global pandemic. At PPL, we've connected with our customers millions of times because we knew that our customers would depend on us. And along those lines, one of the things that we really paid close attention to as this pandemic began in March was that we knew that many customers would be struggling to pay their bills. And during this global pandemic, the last thing we wanted them to do was have to worry about their electric bill. Now more than ever, with more people at home and depending on working from home and school from home, we wanted our customers to know that they did not need to worry about their electric bill. So if customers, if you know anybody who is struggling to pay their bill, encourage them to please call us. We can set up flexible payment plans for them to pay the balance over time. Budget building, we can change even their due date to better align with their finances. Also, many customers will qualify for one of our many assistance programs. We also have Operation Help, which the foundation included over $500,000 of additional funding in March, and also increased the income limit to help more customers. If anybody is struggling to pay their bills, I encourage you to pass along pplelectric.com/bill-help so that we can help them to meet their bill. And finally, in the line of reliability that we've been providing to the community for over 100 years, we know that the best power outage is the one that never happens. And recently, we experienced 1 million avoided outages since 2015. And what that means is that through our investment with smart grid technology, which instantaneously reroutes power in the event of a problem, we were able to avoid 1 million outages. And so at this time when we're all at home, we look at that and we're very proud of that and what it means to the community. We know of no other utility in the country that is able to do that. So again, I want to just thank you all for including PPL in this. Thank you, the Chamber, again, for pivoting and allowing these types of events and forums to happen. Thank you also to our partner, Pat Riley, and Dr. Seyfried. I am so looking forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm interested in what you were saying about the K-shaped recession and others. And with that, I will turn the microphone back over to Alice, but thank you so much again for including PPL.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. And now, as you've heard, we would love to hear from the President and CEO of Mok-Chunk Trust, Pat Riley.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you very much. I think we have a great program ready for us today from Dr. Seyfried, as usual. Should be very interesting. But first, I want to thank Jane for her comments. I was fascinated to know that what PPL has done to prevent blackouts with the smart grid. I'm really impressed. All this time, I thought it was because I've installed a home generator that we haven't had any blackouts. But it's good to know that PPL.
You're not the first, Pat, that has said that.
We have an interesting program, and it's very timely. We had the word unprecedented has been overused in the last several months, but it's been overused because it is especially applicable to our situation. I've been in this business for over 40 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this, what we've experienced here in 2020. So either on the way down or on the way up. But again, it is a wonderful credit to the spirit of our community that we have done so well here in Carbon County. First dealing with the virus and now working our way through the reopening. And but the road ahead is quite challenging. And so the issue of where we're going from here, what kind of how's the economy going to shape up, and what challenges do we see? I think that's why this morning's presentation from Dr. Ed is very timely. Dr. Ed, as you know, has been presenting here for several years. He is a consultant to the banking industry. He operates a number of banking schools, trying to educate slow thinking people like me, and also has taught at Lafayette College and is really quite accomplished. So again, we're fortunate to have him speaking, and without further ado, I will turn the program over to Dr. Ed.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. Boy, I really miss coming up to visit you guys. All these years we've been doing it, and I can see your faces even now in my mind as we shared breakfast together and then the presentations. So sorry we can't be together this year, but hopefully in the future we can pull off a live event. I have so many people to thank. Of course, Pat Riley and Marty McGuire from MCT Bank. We've been working over the last 2-3 months setting up this event today. We were early on planning on a live event, in January. And then, of course, we know what happened in March, April, and we changed over to the virtual event. Marilyn, thanks so much from the Carbon County Chamber. Jane, George, PP&L, I was so happy to hear your short presentation before Pat spoke. I was proud to hear about the customer assistance programs that you're offering. I think that's wonderful. And like Pat, I have a home generator too, and it never goes on. And it's probably because of the work that PP&L does. And all the political and governmental leaders who I hope are on board this morning, a special welcome to you. Thanks so much for all your work during this pandemic. So I want to start, you can imagine putting yourself in my position, what to talk about when there's literally thousands of things we could discuss. And I went back to my professor roots and decided that this session should be more like a classroom, college class than anything else. So we're going to go over a lot of basics so that you understand the format and economic principles surrounding an economic collapse like this. You'll see that this was an unprecedented collapse. This was the worst quarter. The second quarter of this year was the worst we've ever had in our history. We'll learn the basics of recessions and depressions. We'll try to figure out how long this economic collapse is going to last. And then we'll look at recent forecast from the Federal Reserve System as to what their view is on when this literal hell on earth is going to be over. So let's start first with some breaking news. 2 weeks ago or so, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which you heard me talk about many times, issued their third quarter economic forecast and interest rate outlook. Here it is. Notice the yellow font or the gold font is the old forecast from June. The red font is the current one from September. So you'll notice they forecast 3 items: GDP, unemployment, and inflation. We'll look at each one in turn, and I think you'll be able to get a sense of at least from their perspective, where the economy is headed. Now, the Fed is my favorite forecasting service. They have literally thousands of PhDs working across their system with extremely complex modeling and the best computer systems in the world. So let's look at what they're telling us. Go to the GDP growth September 2020, the first row. They're predicting by the end of December of this year, our economy is not going to grow. It's going to shrink by 3.7%. That's alarming, obviously. But notice what they were thinking in June, minus 6.5%. So between June and September, they saw either a shrinking of the virus, a reopening of the economy, or better economic news. Look at next year, 2021. They had been forecasting a 5% growth rate. They knocked it down to 4%, but it's still positive. 2022, 2023, the red font, that's growth rates sort of getting back to normal. Under unemployment, we see a striking fall on their year-end unemployment. They now think unemployment is going to be 7.6% by the end of the year. It's currently 7.9%, so they don't have far to go. They were forecasting 9.3%, so it's a great change. But notice the forecast for 2021, 2022, 2023, and this is a little concerning because the month before the recession hit, February 2020 is the start of the recession, the unemployment rate in February was only 3.5. So notice with respect to unemployment, the Fed doesn't really see us recovering or getting back to the 3.5% unemployment until sometime after 2023, which is, not that great. So you have sort of competing data. The GDP is one way to look at a recession, but so is unemployment. So they're telling us, I think, that the recession should be over in 2021 with respect to GDP growth, but not over until sometime after 2023 in terms of unemployment. With respect to inflation, you can look at the red font. The Fed's goal, as you know, is 2% inflation. And apparently we're not going to get there until 2023. So we're going to have 3 years of below their goal of 2%. For those of you interested in interest rates, here's the famous dot plot. Now, sometimes in the past, I was going over my notes from previous sessions. Sometimes I did talk about the dot plot at this event when we had it at the country club, and most recently by the MCT headquarters. And other years, I did not talk about the dot plot. So if you're new to the dot plot, let me explain to you what it is. This is the very latest from September. Basically, the dot plot is a piece of graph paper with interest rates on the vertical. You can see interest rates from 0 all the way up to 5%. And the dots, those little blue dots, are placed there by the members of the Federal Open Market Committee. They're asked to take a blue pen and put a dot where they think interest rates are going to be at the end of 2020, at the end of 2021, 2022, 2023. Now, they're asked to give their best guess. So each of the individuals on the Federal Open Market Committee, they meet with their staff, they hear reports, and they estimate what they think the rate's going to be at the end of these 4 years. And then you can see the vertical black bar, those blue dots to the right of the vertical black bar represents the future beyond 2023. And you'll notice nobody thinks, not one person on the Federal Open Market Committee thinks that interest rates are going to be raised this year. They all think they're going to stay between 0 and a quarter. Let's call it 0. Nobody thinks the Fed's going to raise interest rates in next year, 2021. Only one person thinks they're going to raise interest rates in 2022. And as you can see, 4 people think they're going to raise interest rates in 2023. Now, what does this mean? Well, basically, when you keep interest rates low, the Federal Reserve is telling the economy, look, the economy needs help. It's sick. There's no inflation, so we can keep interest rates very, very low. If we keep interest rates low, we are supporting the economy. We're trying to get it out of the recession. We're trying to meet our goals of maximum employment. So this graph, the dot plot, gives us a very different look at the economy. Let's go back. Then this graph. Notice the GDP growth for 2021, 2022, 2023 is low but positive, 4%, 3%, 2.5. Yet this graph is showing some sort of need to keep interest rates low through 2023. So again, nothing's clean. I wish I could tell you that the Fed understands your need and my need for sort of clarity, and they're just unable to give it. Their forecast sort of is different from the dot plot. If we're going to have 3% growth, which is sort of normal in 2022, why do we need 0 interest rates? So I realize it doesn't make sense to you, but they've been fairly accurate on their dot plot. So if you're worried about interest rates rising or you're concerned about their movement, here's the picture of it. For the next 3 years or so, not much change in interest rates. When they finally do change after 2023, look at the blue dots to the right of the vertical line. you can see interest rates are predicted to be somewhere between 3 and 2%, somewhere in the middle, 2.5 or maybe 2.25 as sort of the ending point where they're going to rest. For those of you who are customers of MCT and you have a loan or a credit facility, this will help you with respect to the planning interest cost. Although I really wouldn't use it, because 4 years into the future or more on interest rates is a real stretch in my view. Okay, at the meeting there were 2 dissenting votes. 2 people went against the majority. They voted against it, and in this business, when you vote against the majority, your name is now recorded forever. And your name will be in economics textbooks 50 years from now. Why did you vote against the majority? What did you see that you thought they didn't see? Typically, the Federal Reserve likes to have a unanimous decision, but the September 15th, 16th meeting did not have one. It's so-called a double negative, meaning 2 people said no. First one since October of 2019. Who were the dissenters and why did they dissent? Well, the first dissenter was this gentleman, Neil Kashkari, who's the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank. Here's what he said after the meeting. He wanted the Fed to keep rates at 0 until something happens in the economy. So he wasn't happy without saying something like this. And what he wanted to say was, we promise to keep rates at 0 until inflation, when you take out food and energy, which we call core inflation, hits 2% for a sustained period. Now, he didn't identify sustained, but to me, sustained means more than a month or 2 or 3, maybe 6 months, 9 months, a year. Would that be a reasonable definition of sustained? And notice it's not headline inflation. It's inflation minus the food and energy factors, which are very difficult for anyone to control. So 2% core inflation for a sustained period. He wanted the U.S. economy to know this, that look, we're willing to keep rates at 0 until we meet our inflation goal. And here's our inflation goal. The Fed, of course, did not say this, but this is what he wanted said. The second no vote was Robert Kaplan, the Dallas Fed president. He wants the Fed to keep rates low, but he preferred that the committee retain greater policy rate flexibility once it meets its goals. In other words, his view was, look, once we meet our goals of 2% inflation and maximum unemployment, we still may keep interest rates lower just to make sure the economy's strong. So he wanted a statement from his colleagues saying, we understand this is a very difficult time for everybody. And even when we meet our goals, finally, we maybe should be prepared to keep the economy supported by the Federal Reserve for some time after that, just to make sure this recession is behind us. And of course, his other colleagues refused to say that. They didn't want to make that promise. So the 2 no votes, in my view, both wanted something else, something stronger, that their colleagues could not support. We also found out last month some very bad news. And I expect a question in the chat box from some of my friends who are listening in today, who always worry about the federal debt. Recall the previous meetings we've had at the Q&A, I always get a question about the national debt, and I would always poo-poo it. I would say, maybe you shouldn't be worried about it. It's not the total debt that matters, it's the debt to GDP ratio. That's been under 100% for some time. Well, now, apparently we're gonna have it be over 100%, 104.4% exactly, fiscal year 2021. So we're now approaching that very dangerous area where the national debt is greater than our ability to repay it within 1 year, or GDP. Now, I'm worried, like all of you. This is not a good thing. We're pushing our current lifestyle onto future generations. They're the ones who have to pay off the debt. But you should also know that when you list the major economies of the world, we don't have the highest debt to GDP ratio. We're sort of in the middle. There are other countries that are 200, 300% debt to GDP. And that's the only good thing I can say at this point. Well, maybe I could say one more thing. Notice the sharp increase in the debt in 2020. And this is to save us from this recession, from this pandemic. If we wouldn't have had the pandemic, we wouldn't have needed the bailout bill of over almost $3 trillion, and another one that might be coming out any day of another $2 trillion. So, you know, that the PPP loans, the unemployment compensation, auxiliary payments were all part of this debt. And I think a reasonable approach to getting the economy back on its feet after the pandemic and the lockdowns. Now, here's the bad news. Here are the quarterly GDP growth rates, negative and positive, going back to the 1880s. You'll notice the second quarter, 2020 GDP of minus 31.4 is an all-time record. It's the worst quarter we've ever had. So, you know, someday, if you have grandkids, you can tell them what it was like when we lived through the worst quarter ever in United States history, worse than the worst in the Great Depression, minus 31.4%. Okay, I now want to take you back to class. I want to take you back to my advanced macroeconomic class where I would talk about the items we're going to share. I'm going to share with you now. I think it's a good idea to go back and discuss the essentials of recessions and depressions. And let's start with the notion of the business cycle. Are you familiar with these terms? When the economy is growing, we call that the expansion phase. And the day before the recession begins, we say it hits its peak. Then we get this recession. And then eventually we get what we call a trough, or the end of the recession, and then we get the recovery. So you should be familiar with the expansion, the peak, the recession, the trough, and the recovery. They're exactly what you would imagine them to be. And by the way, it is official. The National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, they are the ones that declare when the recession begins and when it ends. And they declared that February 2020 was the start of the recession. That ended the expansion that began in June of 2009. Imagine that. We were growing for 128 months. That's the all-time record for America. The old record was 120 months. That happened between March 1991 and March 2001. So it's funny. You lived through, when you talk to your grandkids someday about it, you lived through the longest expansion ever, 128 months, but you also lived through the worst quarter of growth we've ever had, minus 31.4. So I guess we have to take the good with the bad. For those of you who are in leadership positions, especially people like Pat Riley and Jane George and Marilyn, and all those of you who are listening, who have are responsible for an organization, lead an organization. If you're asked economic questions by your staff, customers, relatives, because I know the folks on this webinar are leaders in your respective businesses or associations, I think the following will help you answer questions that are asked about the current economic conditions. The first one I call the GDP bucket. Now, this is my own personal way of thinking about it. This is how I tell my relatives and neighbors who are concerned. They know what I do for a living. I get emails and calls every day. Oh, Dr. Ed, I'm worried about this. Dr. Ed, I'm worried about my family. I just get laid off. What's going to happen? And I've elected to use my idea of a GDP bucket to explain it. I hope it helps you. So I had an artist friend of mine make this slide up for me. I said, "Could you draw me a bucket with water in it?" "Oh yeah, sure, it's easy." I said, "Good." I said, she said, "What's the water going to be?" I said, "Well, the water is actually going to be a metaphor for GDP. And for those of you who are listening who have businesses, and when you hear the word GDP, your eyes gloss over. And for Pat Riley, who I know knows the answer to this question, the president of MCT Bank, GDP is not only just the total final spending of the American economy, it's the income of all its families, all the households, their mirror images. So if the GDP makes your eyes gloss over, don't think of it that way. It's the ability of consumers, Jane George, to pay their power bill. It's the ability of your clients, Pat Riley, to repay the loans. It's the ability of anyone listening to me who has a business where they've issued credit for your customers to repay that credit. So the fourth quarter of 2019, inflation adjusted, the GDP of America was an amazing 19.2. And just to put that in perspective, Germany's GDP was around 3.7, and they're considered, the giant of Europe. And then what happened? Well, what happened was we had COVID. We had lockdowns, we had fear, we had deaths, and GDP leaked out of the bucket. First quarter, we lost originally 4.8% of GDP. That's now been increased to 5%. We lost about $240 billion. It leaked out. Second quarter, we lost over 30%. You now know that. It's 31.4%. Some $1.5 trillion leaked out of the bucket. So there's another bucket I'm going to show you. And I want you to understand that all was not lost. That yes, the second quarter was the worst quarter ever. But immediately, our political leaders did something. They passed a stimulus bill and they attempted to refill the bucket. Now, the holes in the bucket have not been closed. We put Band-Aids on them. We still have COVID. The president has COVID. Colleges are still not open. Schools are still not open. You heard Jane talk about there's some customers who are having trouble paying their power bills. So there's still an issue. But at least you can say of the $2 trillion or so that leaked out of the bucket, it's been filled up again. It remains, it's dripping, it's leaking, but thank God we had that original stimulus. Now, that's the first way to talk about recessions, depressions. The next way is much more serious, and we teach this in every economics class in the country. We call it the 3 Ds of recessions. And you should memorize these 3 Ds. The depth of the recession is the first D. How much of an economic loss is involved? And we already saw the second quarter. We lost minus 31.4% of the economy. Now, I want you to realize we didn't actually lose minus 31.4%. That's an annualized number. In other words, if we were to lose the same amount for 3 more quarters, then we would have lost minus 31.4%. To get the actual loss, you have to divide by 4. So we lost basically 8% of the economy in the second quarter and 1.25% in the first, because remember, these are annualized amounts. So we measure depth in one of 2 ways, or we can use both. How much does the GDP fall? Or how much does the unemployment rate rise? The second D is called diffusion. What percent of all industries or sectors of the economy are impacted by the recession? Now we know this one this diffusion is not 100%. But some industries have been really hit hard. I don't know if you just saw, my wife and I love to go to movies, and there's a Regal movie theater just a few miles from our house here in Bethlehem, and Regal is closing all their theaters Thursday of this week. Everyone in America is going to be shut down. So the movie theater industry has been severely affected. The airline industry, hotels, Broadway, you can name the ones that have been really hit hard. Well, others, not so much. Amazon, for example, Zoom that we're using today. Housing hasn't been as impacted as bad as we thought it would be. The third D is the most important one for us right today, duration. How long is the recession going to last? How many months? And I'm going to try to answer this today. But this is how we categorize recessions according to the 3 Ds: depth, diffusion, duration. I thought you would like to use the 3 Ds and, at least originally, place the current recession in a 3D framework. Well, depth is very deep. We know that already. The GDP was the worst loss ever, the second quarter. Unemployment got as high as 14%, 14.7% in April. It's fallen since then, but it's likely to remain elevated for a long time. So we would call this a very deep recession. Diffusion, many sectors were affected, obviously, not all of them, but almost all of them, with the airlines, entertainment, lodging, restaurants, of course, and many more under attack. Pat Riley and I had a little chat before we launched the meeting, and he said something that I never thought about, but I'm gonna borrow from you, Pat, if you don't mind. He said this is the only recession where the bars aren't open, which I thought was hilarious. He's right on that. People have no place to go and drink their sorrows away. With respect to diffusion, it could be short. If the virus recedes quickly and all the lockdowns are removed, it could be short. But as you know, New York City has just imposed new lockdowns. California has just imposed new lockdowns. It could be very long. If the virus reemerges, a vaccine is delayed, or the lockdowns are reinstituted. Somebody is not muted, and that's why we're hearing the feedback. So if you're on, please mute yourself. Thanks. Okay. I thought you'd like to look at the 3 Ds historically, just quickly. These are U.S. depressions. I highlighted the red one for us to look at, the Great Depression of 1929, 1933. It lasted 43 months, folks. Could you imagine 3 more years of this mess? The loss in GDP was an amazing minus 32.6. Unemployment got to 24.9% at the peak, and 100% of industries were affected. When you look at the 3 Ds for recessions, and again, I put the red font for the one I want to talk about, the last one we had, the Great Recession of 07-09, that lasted 19 months. We lost 4.3% of our economy. The unemployment rate got to 10.1%. And about 65% of all businesses were impacted during the Great Recession of 07-09. What type can we expect this time? Well, there's also, other than the 3 Ds, we have what we call recession types. And we usually use letters or a symbol. And there are 6 recession types I want to talk about today with you. And at the end of the session, we'll try to pick the one that looks most likely. A V-shaped recession is the one we all want. If you're going to have a recession, this is the kind you want. It hits quickly, but the recovery is very rapid. Look at the letter V, and you see at the bottom of the letter V, there's not much space. A worse kind of recession is called the U-shaped. This is the most common type of all the recessions we've ever had. This is the one that shows up the most. that U-shaped time period is somewhere between 2 and 2.5 years on average that you have to deal with the recession. So you get it, and it takes about 2.5 years to recover, to get back to where you were before the recession started. A rare recession, but we've seen these, the so-called W recession, is exactly what it looks like. The double dip recession. You get a recession, then you get a recovery, but all of a sudden you get another recession. So you think the recovery is coming, but it doesn't last long. And believe it or not, there are actually some pretty well-known people who are suggesting we're going to have this W-shaped recession this year. The worst kind is the L-shaped. This recession is so severe, you never recover. It sort of knocks you out. You're hit with a period of stagnation where you get a little bit of growth and no growth. This is a Japanese experience. They've been dealing with, for 2.5 decades or more, of weak growth after their great depression that they had some 2 or 3 decades ago. There's 2 more shapes, which I'll discuss in a moment. So let's look at the possibilities by letters and see which letter is most likely to occur. I'm going to present the letters by the advocates, the most powerful people who think this is the kind of recession we're going to have. And I'm going to start with James Bullard. He's a powerful person. He's on the FOMC committee. He actually voted 2 weeks ago to keep rates at 0. He's a voting member of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee this year. There he is. He thinks we're going to have a V-shaped recession. The economy could grow by more than 20% in the third quarter. I think the recession was only 2 months long, even though it was very sharp, and now we are in the recovery phase. So he thinks the recession is going to end. Here's what he said more recently. Very rapid third quarter growth may put the U.S. economy within reach of a sort of full recovery by the end of 2020. Wouldn't that be nice? That in 3 months we're out of it. He said for that to happen, we would need a 35% annual rate of growth in the third quarter and just over 10% in the fourth quarter. These are big numbers, but not outside the realm of possibility. He said that just a week or so ago. Now, his vision of the recession looks like this. Notice the June 09 date was the end of the last recession. We grew from June 09 to February 2020, and you should know the answer to this question. How many months was that? And the answer is it was the longest expansion in our history, Dr. Ed. It was 128 months. Cheating a little on how long the recession is. He said it may be 2 months. Let's take it a little bit longer, up through May. And he sees a full recovery by December 2020. So notice the green part of this graph, the far right part, hits the blue part in December 2020. So we get back to where the economy was in February 2020 and December 2020. That's only a 10-month recession, the V. Everyone wants this. You know, once you're in a recession, this is what you're looking for. Is there any data to support Bullard's view? Well, maybe. You've heard me speak of the PMI index, the Purchasing Managers Index. Let's review it. Any number above 50% means manufacturing is rising. Any number below 50% means it's shrinking. But as long as the manufacturing index is above around 43.2%, you don't have a recession. So doesn't it look like April was the low point, at least from a manufacturing perspective? Notice the most recent number for September was 55.4%. The October number, which I have in X's, of course, we're living the month of October. We're not going to know the answer to what October is until November 1st. But let's just hypothesize that the October number is again in the 50%, maybe high 50%. Wouldn't that give some sort of credence to James Bullard V-shaped recession. U-shaped advocate. There are two of them. Loretta Mester, she's the president of the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank. She's on the Federal Open Market Committee, as is Charles Evans. He's the president of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. This is Loretta Mester. She's pessimistic on the chances of a speedy recovery. I do believe that the recovery is going to be a slow one. There's more pain out there. Charles Evans, he thinks unless we get more fiscal spending, we're not going to get rid of the recession. Reduce unemployment insurance benefits and pullbacks in other aid will test the true resiliency of the U.S. economy. The potential hole in aggregate demand may be large, and in my view, more fiscal relief is needed in order to limit further damage to households and businesses. So their view of the recession looks like this. Again, remember, look at the June 09 trough. That would be the beginning of the expansion. It lasted to February 2020. Again, 128 months. Their commentary leads one to believe of a recession which may not end in December 2020, but maybe the beginning of February, beginning of 2022. The W recession advocate is again another Federal Reserve Bank president on the powerful FOMC committee, Esther George. She thinks there's going to be a double dip recession. An important risk is thinking about what happens as we come into the fall. And of course, we're officially in the fall as we hold this event. Whether we see any resurgence in the virus that would cause an additional pullback in the economy. And of course, our president has COVID. I was hopeful in March and April that by the fall, life would be normal, but it's not. My college, Lafayette College, there's no students on campus. It's all virtual. Lehigh's the same way. Penn State's the same way. Sports, college sports are just a small percentage of what they normally are. So we're not sure if the virus is going to come back. There's obviously it's back in the news with the president getting it. It's coming back in Europe. Many countries are seeing a resurgence. Spain, in particular, they're relocking down their economy. So she may be right on this double dip, that we had some recovery in the third quarter, but the fourth quarter of this year and first quarter of next could be weak if the virus hits again and there are more lockdowns. So her vision looks something like this. Again, the blue line we've looked at going forward. If the virus reemerges, you have this famous W-type recession. Then there's a new one, the swoosh recession advocate. And he's from our state's Federal Reserve, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve, Patrick Harper. That's Patrick Harper, and he thinks we're going to have a Nike swoosh type recession. Nothing to do with Nike, but just borrowing their swoosh as a symbol of what the recession shape might look like. Here's what he said. It's definitely not a U. It's probably closer to a swoosh, written with a very shaky hand. We aren't going to see a smooth recovery until the virus is controlled and contained. Now, notice a swoosh has a long tail, and that's what he's getting at, that we're going to be in this for some time. His vision of it might look something like this, with years to get back to the blue height of February 2020. Does that make sense to you, the swoosh? Then there's the L-shaped, and you would hope there aren't many advocates of the L-shaped, but in fact there are people who think this pandemic is so horrible and the economic damage is so real that we're going to take years and years to get out of it. And who thinks this way? latest academic researchers. Victoria Gregory and Guido Menzio from NYU and David Wiczer of Stony Brook, they published a paper in May of this year where they identified what they called fickle workers. And it's the fickle workers who they think are going to cause the L-shaped recession. Who are fickle workers? These are people, when they get unemployed, they tend to stay unemployed. Once they get unemployment compensation, they play that unemployment compensation game as long as they can. If unemployment is extended, like it was in the Great Recession of 07-09, they keep getting it. They look for work only in name only, but their actual real job searches aren't that significant. And it's these fickle workers, if they stay unemployed for a long time, could cause the recession to sort of look like an L. And their view is these are the people that have been hardest hit by the lockdown. So here's the results of their research. They look at it in terms of unemployment. They measure the recession not in GDP, but unemployment. And their research shows that unemployment is going to be 5 percentage points above normal, and normal's around 3.5 to 4. So they see a 9% unemployment rate 30 months after the beginning of the pandemic, which would be sometime through 2022, and 2.5 percentage points above normal for 50 months, which would be, sometime in 2024. We would have unemployment still in the 5 or 6% range because of these fickle workers, the workers who just don't want to go back to work or have trouble getting jobs. I don't want to impugn their integrity. Let's just say they tend to stay unemployed for a long time. And of course, this kind of recession would look like that, sort of L-shaped. Then there's a so-called new one, a letter we've never used before. And in 2020, we've had two new kinds of recession types: the swoosh, which we just looked at, and the so-called K-shaped recession. What's K-shaped? What does it mean? What does it look like? Well, the K-shaped recession came up during the the presidential debate from last week when Joe Biden felt like we have a K-shaped recession. A K-shaped recession looks like something like this, where the recovery only works for a certain group of people. The people on the green part of the economy, but many people will not recover. So a K recession is if you have higher income, if you have family wealth, you're going to recover. But if you're low income, not a lot of job skills, you're not going to recover. So a K-shaped recession is sort of breaking America down by their financial wealth and their ability to find a job. And there is some truth to this. Look at unemployment by educational attainment put out by the Labor Department. And this is from the beginning of the pandemic in March until the latest data through September of this year. Notice if you have a bachelor's degree or higher, the change in unemployment really wasn't that bad for your group. And now you're almost back to where you were at the beginning. Some college or an associate's degree, you're still down about 10% in September, even though you were down about 18% at the peak. High school graduates got hit very hard. They lost about 22% of their employment opportunities. And even today, they're still down 15%. And people without a high school diploma, they suffered an enormous drop in employment opportunities. And even today, they're still around 20% down in terms of opportunities. So this would be an example of maybe the first two lines being the upper arm of the K, and the lower two lines being the lower arm of the K. So let's go over this, the winners and losers in a K-shaped recession. The winners, the upper arm of the K, they'd be well-educated workers, families with underlying wealth, businesses tied to the digital economy, whereas lower arm of the K, lower wage workers, workers without credentials, many of the brick and mortar businesses that have suffered dramatically, and of course, regions tied to tourism have been hurt and have not recovered yet. So I think there's something to the K-shaped recession, but I should tell you, in terms of economics, we don't differentiate between rich and poor or those who do real well and those who don't do real well. We blend them all together. So the K-shaped recession, I think, is a good way to understand the current recession, but it will not be used in the economic literature to describe it. It's either going to be a V, a U, a W, or an L, because we blend all these workers together into one. We blend their income into one. We blend their spending into one. And the K-shape is perhaps a good way to look at it, but historically, we're not going to do it. Now, it's a little early, but you've heard now the advocates of each of these shaped recessions. And do we have the possibility of a V-shaped recession like James Bullard said? Could we get growth extremely high in the third quarter? Now, the third quarter ended, as you know, September 30th. We're not going to get the results of the third quarter until the end of this month, early November. But we do have some pretty good forecasts, very recent forecasts. Here's the most recent one from the New York Fed, October 2nd, just last Friday. They predict the third quarter will grow by 14% and the fourth quarter by 4.8%. Now, that's not enough to recover the minus 31.4% we lost in the second quarter and the minus 5% we lost in the first quarter. So if the New York Fed is correct, there will not be a V-shaped recovery by the end of the year, like James Bullard suggesting. On the other hand, the latest forecast from the Atlanta Fed, their so-called GDP Now forecast, and at previous events, the previous breakfast events that we've had, you remember I've asked you to look at the GDP Now, and many of you have it on your cell phones. It's the Atlanta Fed's forecasting tool, and amazingly, look at their forecast from October 1st, 34.6. If the Atlanta Fed's forecast is correct, then I think James Bullard V-shaped recession becomes a possibility, does it not? Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, gee, Dr. Ed, how can they have such different forecasts? Well, they do. And let's see who won the battle of the forecast last quarter. So, right before the second quarter number was released of minus 31.4, New York Fed said the forecast was 14.3 down. The Atlanta Fed said it was minus 32.1 down. The actual number was minus 31.4. Now, if this were a basketball game, it would be Atlanta 100, New York nothing. So I don't know what's going to happen in the third quarter. I'm praying that the Atlanta Fed GDP Now forecast is correct, like it was the second quarter, because if it is correct, that V-shaped recession becomes a real possibility, doesn't it? I think it becomes more likely than any other letter if we get a growth rate that would wipe out the loss of the second quarter. If we could get a growth rate over 30%, wouldn't that be spectacular? Okay. A question I get asked at all of these events is the question of negative interest rates. People like Pat Riley would lose sleep over negative interest rates. Could you imagine a banker paying you to borrow money? And I know that sounds crazy, but there are actually negative interest rates in Europe as we speak. In Denmark, for example, if you borrow money to buy a home, a 15-year loan is minus 0.5. So you still make your monthly payment, but at the end of the day, in 15 years, you paid them back less than you borrowed. Not a good thing for bankers, as you can imagine. So what's going on with negative rates? What's going on with rates in general? Let's listen to some of our leaders. I don't think we're going to have negative interest rates. Here's why. First of all, Jerome Powell, this is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, recently said, we're not even thinking about raising rates. This is not a typo, folks. It's an interesting way to say, forget about raising rates. That's not happening. We're not even thinking about it. He also talks about negative interest rates. All FOMC participants, and that's not a sentence you get to say very often, meaning we don't have a consensus very often, but all FOMC participants currently do not judge that negative rates appear to be an attractive monetary policy tool in the United States. He went on to say, going forward, our inclination would be to rely on the tools that we did use as opposed to negative rates. When you have negative rates, you wind up creating downward pressure on bank profitability, which limits credit expansion. And I'm sure Pat Riley is happy to hear the leader of the banking system saying something as wise as this. But the real problem on negative rates is pointed out by Charles Evans, the Chicago Fed president. Negative interest rates aren't going to be the tool that we decide to use at this point, or probably at any point. For one thing, the optimal setting of the negative interest rate is probably such a large negative number that nobody would contemplate it. We would need to be minus 5% or more than that. So that's not happening. I went ahead and I looked at the Fed futures market, looking at the March 2021 Fed meeting. This is 9 months from now, 6 months from now. There's 100% probability based on the Fed's futures market that the rate's going to be 0 to 0.25 at that meeting, not negative. There's no money being bet on a negative rate. Okay. I want to go over the GDP results with you for 2002, quarter two, because as bad as it was, there's a ray of hope in it. And I wanted you all to see the ray of hope. You remember our famous GDP equations from previous meetings. It's a sum of consumer spending, C, investment spending, I, government spending, G, export spending, and we subtract import spending. Recalling the first quarter GDP, it fell minus 5%. That's January, February, and March. And remember, the lockdown only occurred probably the first week, second week in March. So it hurt us dramatically, minus 5%. This is worse than the Great Recession of 07-09. And by the way, remember there are 3 estimates. This is the third and final estimate. The second quarter, now this is official, minus 31.4. And again, this is the largest drop ever. And you can see it when you read the statement that accompanied the latest press release on the GDP. I'll let you read it. And as you read it, you can see the government's trying to explain why it's so big, why it's so negative. And basically, they're saying it's because of COVID and the stay-at-home orders. And when you look at the bars, the bar graph of the year 2020, it's unbelievable how big the bar graphs are compared to the previous 4 years, when almost always it's between 0 and 5%, 0 and 4%. It never gets above 5, and you can see the minus 31.4. Here's a map of states and what they did in the second quarter. Some states really suffered. Look at Hawaii in the far left corner of the graph. The governor of Hawaii basically shut off the island from the mainland, and they lost almost half of their economy. We had 34%, and I can tell you this by following Pennsylvania all these years, we're almost always equal to the national rate, almost exactly. The national rate was minus 34.1, we're minus 34. It's amazing. Our sectors in the Pennsylvania economy must be identical to what we have nationwide, because it's always very, very close to the national numbers. Our unemployment rate is usually the same as the national unemployment rate. Our inflation is the same as the national rate, and the GDP growth is the same. Notice Washington, D.C., they had the smallest growth drop in GDP, and again, that's the government spending didn't go away that much. Here's the component growth going back the last 3 quarters. I'm just going to let you look at these. Notice the collapse of exports, dropping 64%, imports 54.1, investment spending 46.3, consumer spending 33.2. Just an aside, because I know what some of you are thinking, Dr. Ed, why was government spending only up 2.5%? Didn't we have the $2.5 trillion bailout? We did, but it doesn't get counted in this, and here's why. If we counted the $2.5 trillion of the first bailout in government spending, and that money was PPP loans, was unemployment compensation for unemployed people, would be double counting, because eventually those people are going to spend the money. So if we counted it under government and PPP loans, and in $600 a week unemployment compensation, would be double counting it. So we only count it once, and we do it at the final level. So we don't count it as government spending. It'll show up in consumer spending, investment spending, export spending somewhere down the road. Here's the amounts. Again, the GDP from the first quarter to the second quarter, you can see it fell from 21.5 trillion to 19.5 trillion. So think of the bucket example I showed earlier. Think of the money that leaked out of the bucket. You can see it right there. Consumer spending fell almost by $1.5 trillion. Investment spending fell about 500 billion, half a trillion. Again, government spending increased, but not by as much as you would think, because again, the bailout bill money is not included in G. Exports fell dramatically, imports fell dramatically, and you can see net exports got deeper in trade deficit. In terms of the contribution to GDP, and remember, if you add up all these columns, it should equal the growth rate. So consumers were the real problem, consumers and investment spending. Now, spending dropped of almost $1.5 trillion in the second quarter. And I thought you'd like to see where that happened. Motor vehicle sales, and this is not a misprint. I rechecked it Friday. It's identical, surprisingly, that rarely happens, to the previous quarter. So no change in motor vehicle sales. But look at hotels. So if you own a restaurant, you know this number hit you hard, and it's obvious to see this here. Clothing and footwear, that fell too, because nothing was open. So this was mostly internet sales. Gasoline. People work from home. They didn't drive to work. So you can see the commuting savings in gasoline to the consumer. The real shock is healthcare. And you wondered about this, but I have a good friend who has AFib, and they would not give him an ablation during the lockdown. It was considered non-essential. It wasn't non-essential to him, but he had to wait till the that first lockdown was lifted before he could even get his ablation. And so a lot of non-essential, quote, non-essential healthcare was prohibited, and you saw the big drop in healthcare spending. With respect to investment spending, structures and buildings fell, equipment spending fell, R&D was reduced, housing is part of investment, that fell. The big thing was inventories. And if you went shopping and tried to buy toilet paper or bleach, you know exactly why this number is minus 298.4 billion. Government spending, total government spending increased slightly. Federal increased, defense increased, non-defense increased, but surprisingly, state and local spending fell during the second quarter. Now, that's all bad news, I agree, but there is some good news. Here's the good news. Personal savings increased by a whopping $3.1 trillion during the second quarter, which means there's a lot of dry powder for an eventual recovery. For example, total savings went from 1.6 trillion to 4.71 trillion in the second quarter. Look at the savings rate. It went from 9.6 to 25.7. Folks, I remember when that was negative. Now it's amazing how all this works its way through the economy. I'm on the board of a bank. And I'm not going to talk about Pat Riley's bank because I don't know his numbers, but I can tell you about my bank that I'm on the board of. During the second quarter, we normally make a large amount of money, I'll be honest with you, a large amount of money from overdraft protection fees. People bounce checks. They run out of money at the end of the month before their paycheck gets deposited, and they spend money anyway. And when they do that, they overdraw their accounts. Our overdraft protection fee income fell by 30% in the second quarter because people had so much big balances in their checking accounts and money market accounts. You can see this. So what happened was the government gave out all this money and people didn't spend it. It's in their accounts. It's in their savings accounts. And here's the proof of it right in front of you. Savings went from 1.6 trillion to 4.7 trillion. In other words, we gave everyone money to spend, but they didn't spend it. They held on to it. Why? Well, they were afraid. They're afraid they may lose their job. They don't know what the future holds. Maybe they couldn't get out to spend it. Maybe they live in a state where they were prohibited, like us here in Pennsylvania. What could we do during the lockdown? We couldn't spend money if we wanted to. So this is the one good sign to me that people have money. Now, if the lockdowns continues, if unemployment remains high, I don't think people are going to spend it. I think it's going to stay unspent, which means the recession is going to be more of a U-shape than a V-shape. So to me, it's really dependent on the virus. If it reemerges and there's more lockdowns, the money will stay in these accounts. If the lockdowns ended, as you know, in PA, we're still under lockdown, the partial lockdown. It all depends on the virus, in my view. Okay, Pat, that's the end of my presentation. Before we open up to see if there's any questions or not in the chat box, let me just review what we talked about for a minute. In the remaining time, we'll answer any questions we might have been asked. First of all, it's a bad recession. We all know that. And I've asked you to consider going back to class with me so that you can talk intelligently about recessions, depressions with your colleagues, with your customer base, with your relatives. We reviewed the terminology of the business cycle. We know what the expansion means. We know what the peak and trough means. We know what the recession and recovery means. We thought about the economy with respect to a bucket filled with GDP, and then draining the bucket because of the pandemic, and then filling the bucket back up with federal relief stimulus money. We learned about the 3 Ds: the depth of the recession, the diffusion of the recession, and the duration of the recession. And then most importantly, we studied the 6 symbols, either letters or symbols, which can characterize any recession: a V-shaped, a U-shaped, a W-shaped, an L-shaped, a K-shaped, and the so-called swoosh recession. We looked at advocates of each of these letters. People will think that one of these letters or symbols is the most likely kind of recession. As it turns out, me personally, I'm somewhere between the V and the U. And I'm waiting till the end of October to see what happened in the third quarter. Did the consumer begin to spend money? I noticed more traffic on the highways. I noticed the restaurants are filled. Did they spend some of the money that they had saved in the second quarter? Will the Atlanta GDP Now forecast of 34% be correct, or will the Fed New York forecast of 14% growth be correct? If the Atlanta Fed forecast is correct, I think we're going to have closer to a V-shaped. If we don't get the robust spending in the third quarter, or the virus comes back and there's more physical lockdowns by states, like is happening in Europe as we speak, then I think I'm afraid we're going to see the U-shaped. I don't anticipate the L. I really don't. The W maybe. The swoosh, I hope not. I'm praying for the V, or at least a very tight U. Okay, Pat. Do you have any questions, Pat, of me, or comments before we see if there's anything in the chat box?
No, I think you kind of gave an idea of what you're hoping for. Ed, which are there specific events that would take place, or policies that could take effect that would impact the shape of the recovery going forward?
I think so. I think if Congress got the second stimulus bill passed, that consumers would feel wealthier, that have more income in their accounts, I think they'd spend. So yeah, I think a second stimulus bill would go a long way to making a V. Secondly, a vaccine, which has been promised, any day now, that's well received and works, would, I think, shake some of that money loose that the consumers are holding on to. I actually have friends that Robin and I go to dinner with. We've been going to dinner with them for years. We haven't seen them yet. In one case, the wife's just afraid to go out. She's been locked in her house. I know it's hard to believe, but there are some people who are deathly afraid of this virus, and they don't want to go to movies. They don't want to go to dinner. They don't want to be around other people. I know there are not many left. I hope there aren't many left, but I know there's some that feel that way. So yeah, to me, a stimulus bill, a cure or vaccine would be a big change. And of course, the elephant in the room is the election. Biden has been, I think he's waffling on certain topics. At first he said the first day he would shut down fracking, which would kill Pennsylvania, especially the western part of the state and the north central part of the state with respect to energy exploitation, energy development. He's threatened a lockdown until the spring if the virus reemerges. That would be problematic, I think, in terms of the V-shaped. I think a lockdown, a federal lockdown, would be would kill the V-shaped possibility and would now get into the U-shape. So those three events that haven't happened yet, the course of the virus and the vaccine, number one. Number two, the stimulus package, which apparently is developed and ready to be delivered, but there's still political wrangling going about it. And of course, the results of the election would probably be the most important three things we could think about right now that would determine a V, a U, a W, or worse. Pat, what's your take on it as a banker? What do you see?
Well, the sense that right now, again, it's very difficult from our point of view to say what's going on with the economy. You know, we've been out talking with customers. The feedback we've got is a lot of cautious optimism. Some businesses have done remarkably well, depending on the nature of the business. As you say, talk about K-shaped, I think it's almost, I'd say it's more like a busted F. Some people have done, you know, there's been actually an increase in their business, while other people have seen their business just decimated. And the key to that turnaround is how quickly we start to open up and get back to some sense of order. But what we're looking ahead and trying to see is just how long it's going to take and what the impact. Right now, there seems to be a lot of money sloshing about. You talked about the increase in the savings rate. Well, again, you have PPP money out there. You have you've got the stimulus checks that are out, and we've seen a tremendous increase in deposits. But loan demand has been you know, a little more flat, except for the PPP loans. So we're really interested to see how this all plays out 3-4 months down the road. Personally, I think, you know, looking at party platforms, I think you're going to see a recovery. I think that the speed of the recovery will be driven by who's elected. And you know, if you look back at the prior recession and recovery, you know, I don't want to get partisan here, but I think there was some policies put in place that really prolonged or slowed down the rate of recovery in the last recession. And I think if we see a return to those kind of policies, i.e., you know, a stronger regulatory front, a little more, I should say, a more aggressive regulatory framework, higher tax rates, I think the recovery will take longer to get back to where we were in February. That's my opinion, you know, humble country banker. So,
Marilyn, what do you see at the chamber level in terms of new business, pullbacks?
So, Dr. Ed, this is Alice. Marlon did have to get off the call here just a bit ago, but
Okay.
you know, we have seen new businesses opening up here in Carbon County. They are definitely trickling in, but amidst the pandemic, we do have people coming in, speaking with Kathy Henderson in economic development, being coached with our friends at the Small Business Administration. So we do see that people are hopefully taking those $3.1 trillion in savings and investing it into new businesses. But again, it is definitely slower than it's been, but we are seeing it here in Carbon County.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask you is there's some anecdotal evidence that here in Eastern PA, we're seeing New Yorkers and New Jerseyites move into PA. Is that a rumor in Carbon as well, that you're seeing people move from those high tax, sort of dangerous areas into safer areas of Eastern PA?
That is not a rumor, and I'm kind of looking at the guest list real quick to see if there's any realtors from the northern part of our county on here. And at first glance, I don't really see any, but that's not a rumor. We are seeing home sales, especially in like the Tallahassee Trail, Penn Forest areas, really increasing, and it is those folks that are coming in from New York. So we are seeing that here in Carbon County. That's
interesting. Very interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience in the minutes that remain?
Before we head over to that, Kathy Henderson does want to add a little bit on the folks moving in, and I'm going to go ahead and have her unmute herself. Kathy, go ahead if you wanted to comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Alice. Hello, Dr. Ed. Thank you for your presentation. As always, it's very enlightening. I've spoken to several of my realtor friends about the market lately, and houses, it is a seller's market here in Carbon County, and I believe in most of the Pocono region. Houses are not staying on the market more than 2 or 3 days. The average sales price has gone up dramatically, and also there have been, within the last month, over 26 homes over the price of $300,000 that are going into closing or into escrow. There are bidding wars. Houses are selling for more than the list price. multiple offers coming in on homes. And yes, the majority of those people are people moving in from New York. The question I did ask the realtors was, are they buying them as second homes, or are they buying them as their primary residences? And they don't have data showing that answer to that question. So that's still a question that's out there in my mind. But I would hazard a guess to say that it's primary residence right now. It harkens back to 9/11 when the same thing occurred. Prices went up, real estate, people were buying, they were moving out of the city because of 9/11. They're doing the same thing now, but because of the pandemic. But now what's different is majority of them are able to work from home. So our challenge here in Carbon anyway is internet service for those people who are working from home. Their children are attending school virtually, and telemedicine, telehealth, doctor visits and such. So yes, the real estate market is hot here in Carbon and most of the northeastern PA.
Thanks for that report, Kathy. That's fascinating. Again, that's strong data that you're giving. We're seeing the same thing down here. I have a number of friends who are in the real estate region, but again, that question of second home versus primary home hasn't been answered completely yet. And we're also seeing, and I really like this. I have a banker friend from Johnstown, PA. He's been my friend for a long, long time. He was my student at the Pennsylvania Banking School and a graduate school of banking. And he has a daughter who he loves and who was a photographer in New York City. She lived there like 5 or 6 years. She's in her late 20s. And she wasn't doing too well as a photographer. She had an apartment, a small apartment that her father financed for her. And my buddy called me about a month ago, and he said, "Guess what?" I said, "What?" He said, "My daughter's coming home." I remember, "What?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "Dad, I'm afraid up here. I'm afraid to go get a cup of coffee. Everything's boarded up. I want to come home, and I want to live in Johnstown." He goes, "You want to live in Johnstown?" She says, "Yeah." She said, I had my fill of New York City. It was glamorous for a while, but now me and my friends are scared to death. So I'm coming home. Is that all right? He said, "Yeah, I'm happy to have you home. Plus it'll save him like $2,000 a month on a 1-bedroom apartment." So yeah, Kathy, I think that's happening. You get enough information and you can sort of see that we're benefiting in a way, are we not, from the social injustice movement in New York? And it's going to be interesting to see what happens to rental prices and home prices in New York and New Jersey. We only have a minute left. Do we have any chat box questions? I can answer one or two if you like.
We just had a comment come in from Greg M, who said the housing is the seller's market also in the Lehigh Valley. There's an increase in warehousing in Carbon and Lehigh, and it will continue to drive up the housing demand. So that's just a comment that came in from Greg regarding the increase in the Lehigh Valley. We did have a question come in. Is now a good time to start a business, Dr. Ed?
It depends what that business is, isn't it? For example, and I know Pat Robert like this. On my bank board, we have to approve loans over a certain amount. And there was a loan that came in from a movie theater. And this bank is not in Pennsylvania, it's out of state. And it was a $9 million loan to expand and refurbish a movie theater. And I said to the loan officer, you're kidding me, right? He said, "What do you mean?" I said, of all the industries you may not want to get into, with the development of Netflix and the pandemic, will people ever go to movies again? He said, "Oh, of course they will." And I said, I gotta abstain from this vote because I always want to vote with what the management brings to me, but I'm really nervous about this. So, whoever asked the question, yeah, I think if you're going to open up a movie theater, it's probably not a good idea. But if you're going to open up some sort of internet store, or online catalog store, I think you have pretty good chance of success. If you're going to get involved at all in e-commerce, yeah, I think you're going to probably make it. So the answer is depends on what you're doing. Would a brick and mortar store make sense today? Probably not. You know, I mean, just drive by your local mall and you see how empty everything is. I know we're over our time and we never like to do that. So I'm finished with all my comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ed, again, for a wonderful presentation full of information. If anyone does have any questions that pop into their mind over the next couple hours or couple days, they can send them our way here at the chamber, and we'll make sure that Dr. Ed does receive them so that he can help answer your questions. Again, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank PPL Electric Utilities for being our sponsor today, and of course, Pat and his team at Mock Chunk Trust for bringing today's event to all of you. Continue to watch your emails for upcoming events, virtual and in person, with the Carbon Chamber, and enjoy the rest of your day.